So we have listened to a piece of nationalist music when we listened to Smetana's Moldau, where he described the river in his country in instrumental terms. Now we're going to talk about sort of the opposite of nationalism, and that is exoticism. So in exoticism, an artist of whatever type would choose to create an artwork that depicts some culture that's not their own. So we're in the 19th century, and people are really beginning to travel a bit more, and they know a bit more about other cultures. That doesn't necessarily mean that an artist, whether it's a composer or a visual artist or an author, had actually been any place that they were trying to depict. But it was just one of those things they wanted to do. Remember, they're very much interested in everyday people, sort of supernatural, and exotic is not supernatural necessarily, but if you don't know another culture, it might seem a little supernatural to you. So they're trying to depict these other cultures through their artwork. So we saw the paintings by Delacroix, where he painted the people in Algeria and Morocco, so that would be an example. We talked about Madame Butterfly being an opera that's set in Japan, even though she sings beautifully in Italian because the composer was Italian. So we're going to look at a lengthy piece now of music that represents exoticism. This is by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was a Russian composer who is very much known for his work with orchestration. You may remember we talked about that as one of our characteristics of the style period, that composers really were purposeful about how they used an instrument in composition. So they studied the instruments. They understood what an instrument could do. They knew the best way to get an effect out of an instrument to create a particular sound. So Rimsky-Korsakov is the ultimate master of orchestration. A lot of music that you know that's very familiar from that time period may have been written by somebody else, but then Rimsky-Korsakov went back and reorchestrated it so that the instrumentation made more sense. There are also a lot of examples of what we call transcription in this period, where a composer might write a piece for, say, piano, and then somebody like Rimsky-Korsakov could come along later, or even the same composer, and transcribe that piece that was written for piano to orchestra. So you can imagine if you go from the sound of the piano, which is a very uniform kind of sound, to using the entire orchestra and all the many different colors that you have available, that you really have to understand the instruments and the sounds they make. And Rimsky-Korsakov was the master of that. So the piece that we're going to look at, remember he's Russian, the story he's going to tell us is the story of the 1001 Nights. The title of the piece is Scheherazade. So Scheherazade is the main character in the 1001 Nights saga. Just to remind ourselves what that story's about, we have a sultan who marries women, and then he marries them one day, spends the night with them, and kills them the next day. So he's got this pattern going. Well, then he marries Scheherazade, and she knows the pattern. She doesn't want to be the next one. So she decides that what she will do is that every night she will tell him a story. And she will leave just enough cliffhanger on that story that he won't kill her, because he's going to want to know what happens next. And she spins this out for the legendary 1001 Nights, at which point he decides that he no longer needs to keep killing off his wives the next day. So he's had this one for a while. So in Rimsky-Korsakov's interpretation of this is a multiple movement piece, which makes good sense because she's telling multiple stories. Obviously, he's not telling all 1001 stories. That would be a piece that would last forever. So what he has chosen are 4 stories from the series, and they don't happen sequentially in her storytelling. He just picked ones that he thought would make good musical representations. So we're going to listen to each of those movements individually, and I'm going to tell you what they're about before you start, so you can think about picturing what Rimsky-Korsakov was trying to depict in the movement. So the first movement starts out with the character of Sinbad the Sailor, who actually is a kind of a recurring character in the 1001 Nights story. So Sinbad was actually the son of a wealthy man, but sort of like the prodigal son, he's wasted all his money. And so he has to keep going back to sea and going on voyages and bringing back more good stuff, so he'll have some money. So he in his voyages, and he has 7 of those, he keeps running into these amazing things like these giant underwater snakes and horses that live underwater. So we've got the fantastic element already. We've got our supernatural kind of element. So in the musical depiction of it, we have to set up the story first. So we know that we've got the Sultan and we've got Scheherazade. So it starts out with this really powerful brass sound, and that sound, whenever you hear it in this piece, that's the Sultan, because he's the big, powerful man. So that's his part. Scheherazade is represented by the first violin. This is actually almost like a violin concerto, because the violin part is so important. It has all these wonderful solos, and it really functions more like a solo instrument that is a part of the orchestra. So that solo violin, think that's Scheherazade when we get to that point. So you imagine her telling the story. So in this first movement, Sinbad's at sea, so you might listen for the sound of the rocking of the ocean, which is a pretty common sort of thing that we tend to hear in music. Listen for the violin solo, and at the very end, see how even Rimsky-Korsakov sort of leaves us hanging, because that's not the end of the story, right? Scheherazade's coming back for another tale in a minute. So now listen to the Sinbad the Sailor movement of Scheherazade. All right, so now we're ready for the second story in our 1001 Tales. In this particular movement, which is called the Kalendar Prince, and that's calendar with a K, the Kalendar Prince is the son of a king, and he his father has been overthrown, so he's no longer in charge of his kingdom. And because the son would be a threat to whoever was overthrown, because he would be the next king, he's been banished. So he goes to live with an uncle. And then there's a whole lot of battles, and it turns out that this young man's family is killed, and he doesn't know it because he's at the uncle's place, and they're a wandering tribe. So this is all supposed to be happening in the Middle East. The whole story is sort of Middle Eastern, but this part of the story is also set in the Middle East. So what Rimsky-Korsakov does is uses the bassoon and the oboe, which are double reed instruments, which are very typical kinds of instruments in Middle Eastern sound, to create that sound that we associate with. If you think snake charmers and belly dancers, you will have the full effect of what the kind of sound we're going through. So you might listen for battle sounds. How does he create the sound that there's been this big battle? And at the end, again, see how he closes us out. So we're set up for that next section of the story. So again, we have a prince. His family he's been banished. His family is going to be killed. Some of the time he's happy because he doesn't know about that. And then we may find that he has also discovered the fate of his family, and his mood may change. So now listen to the second movement of Scheherazade. All right, so now we've had Sinbad, we've had this prince. Now we've got our love story, because you can't have a good piece of storytelling or a good piece of music without a love story connected. So here we have a prince and a princess. The prince lives in the Middle East somewhere. The princess is in China. So we've gotten really exotic now. We've gotten way on the other side of even Russia. So in the story, the prince, he's supposed to get married. The prince always has to get married, right? That's just part of the story. But he wants to marry for true love. Another standard story. So he's refused to marry the person that his father wants him to marry. So he's been locked into this tower. Well, basically the same thing is happening in China with the princess. Her father wants her to marry somebody she doesn't want to marry. She's been locked away in a tower. So the whole story involves some fairies, a few genies, other supernatural kinds of creatures, which we love in our romantic nature. And what happens is that the prince is transported magically to the princess's tower. But she's asleep through the whole thing. And he leaves, he falls in love with her even though she's asleep. Go figure. So he leaves her a ring. And then he's taken back to his own tower. Well, she wakes up and she has this ring that she doesn't really know where it came from, but somehow she knows that there's love in here. So eventually the two families kind of come together. There's somehow China and the Middle East get together, and they discover that she has his ring already, and therefore all these stories he's been telling about this one woman that he's in love with and he wants to marry are proved to be true because her ring, he has the ring to document the story. So listen to this movement about the Chinese princess and the Middle Eastern prince, and let's see how Rimsky-Korsakov treats that. Okay, in the final movement of Scheherazade, we're going back to the story of Sinbad. Remember, he had 7 voyages, so Rimsky-Korsakov had plenty of subject matter to choose from there. So at this point, Sinbad has returned home to Baghdad. So if you imagine the story of the prodigal son, he comes back and there's the big party, right? So this final movement is the festival, the rejoicing that Sinbad has returned from his journeys and, resolving that sort of story. But remember that we also have to resolve the big story of Scheherazade and the Sultan. So we would assume that because this is the final movement of Rimsky-Korsakov's set, that he's going to finalize this now, and the Sultan is going to relent and realize that Scheherazade is the woman for him, and all will be well at the end. So enjoy this last movement of this great example of exoticism by Rimsky-Korsakov, Scheherazade.